May 11th, 2022, 9:45 in the evening, a quiet residential neighborhood in Austin, Texas. Most houses were winding down for the night, their windows glowing with the warm light of families settling in for the evening. The air was still warm from the lingering Texas heat, and the streets were empty except for the occasional car passing through. A man returned home after spending the day at a friend's house. He pulled into the driveway, grabbed his bag from the passenger seat, and walked toward the front door. But as he reached for his keys, he noticed something unusual. The living room lights that should have been on were completely dark. "Moriah?" he called out as he stepped inside. No answer. The house was silent. Too silent. She said she was going to the pool. He thought to himself, maybe she's not back yet. Without much concern, he made his way through the darkened house toward the bathroom. He had been out all day and wanted to take a shower before bed. He turned the door handle, flipped on the light switch, and in that moment, everything changed. A scream pierced the silence. On the bathroom floor lay a young woman. Around her body, vivid bloodstains had formed dark pools on the tile. Her eyes were open but unseeing. There was no movement, no breath, no life. The woman was Moriah Wilson. She was 25 years old. She was one of America's most promising gravel racing athletes. She had traveled to Austin to compete in what should have been the race of her career. Instead, she had become a murder victim. The 911 call came in at 9:50 in the evening. "There's a woman with gunshot wounds." The caller's voice shook with panic. "She's not breathing. I think she's dead. Please, you need to send someone right now." Austin Police Department patrol units arrived within minutes. What the responding officers found in that bathroom would haunt them for years to come. 3 gunshot wounds, 2 to the head, 1 directly to the heart. Every bullet had precisely hit vital organs. This was not random violence. This was not a crime of passion in the heat of an argument. This was execution. Even more stunning was the timing. Moriah was scheduled to compete in the Gravel Locos race just 3 days later, on May 14th. She was rated as the #1 favorite to win. Competitors from across the country had traveled to Texas specifically to race against her, knowing she was at the peak of her abilities. And now, just 72 hours before she would have stood at that starting line, she lay dead in a stranger's bathroom. Investigators began processing the scene immediately. Shell casings were recovered from the bathroom floor. The medical examiner would later confirm they came from a 9mm handgun. But there was one more detail that caught the attention of the lead detective. Moriah's expensive racing bike had disappeared. This was not just any bicycle. It was a custom-built gravel racing machine worth thousands of dollars, specifically designed for her body dimensions and riding style. Had this been a robbery gone wrong? But as investigators expanded their search of the surrounding area, they found the bike abandoned in nearby bushes, less than 2 blocks away, just thrown into the shrubs like a piece of trash. If this was a robbery, why didn't the perpetrator take the valuable bike? Why go through the trouble of stealing it only to abandon it minutes later? Nothing else in the house had been touched. No drawers had been ransacked. No valuables were missing. The lead detective stood in that bathroom, looking at the precise placement of those bullet wounds, and had an instinct born from decades of experience. This was not a robbery. Someone had tried to make it look like one, but the staging was sloppy, almost an afterthought. So who was the real perpetrator? And why would someone murder an innocent athlete just 3 days before the biggest race of her life? The answer, investigators would soon discover, lay in a toxic love triangle. A shocking story where love became obsession. Obsession became surveillance, and surveillance became murder. This is the story of how digital technology designed to bring people closer together became the tool of a killer. This is the story of Moriah Wilson. To understand what happened in that Austin bathroom, we need to go back to the beginning. We need to understand who Moriah was, not as a victim in a crime scene photograph, but as a living, breathing human being with dreams and talent and a future that was stolen from her. Moriah Wilson was born into a family where athletic excellence ran in the blood. Her father, Eric Wilson, had been a member of the United States national ski team, competing at the highest levels of alpine racing. Her aunt had competed in the Olympics not once but twice as a Nordic skier, representing her country on the world's biggest stage. The athletic DNA that had flowed through generations had found its way to Moriah, but it was more than just genetics. It was a culture, a way of life that her family had instilled in her from the youngest age. She grew up in Vermont, a state that many consider America's outdoor sports paradise. Winters meant skiing for everyone, from small children to grandparents. The mountains were covered in pristine snow, and families would spend entire weekends on the slopes. Summers brought a different kind of adventure. The same mountains that provided skiing in winter became perfect terrain for mountain biking when the snow melted. In this environment, surrounded by natural beauty and athletic excellence, Moriah naturally dreamed of becoming a ski racer. Her path seemed clear and certain. She attended Burke Mountain Academy, an elite ski school in Vermont that had produced multiple Olympic gold medalists. The school's reputation was legendary in the skiing world. To be accepted, there meant you had real potential, and to excel, there meant you were destined for greatness. Moriah's growth was nothing short of phenomenal. She worked harder than most of her peers, often staying late on the slopes to practice specific techniques. Her coaches saw something special in her, a combination of natural talent and fierce determination that is rare even among elite athletes. By the time she reached the junior level, she had placed third in alpine skiing at the United States Junior National Championships, third in the entire country, at such a young age. As she transitioned into adulthood, Moriah continued competing in alpine skiing at Dartmouth College, one of the Ivy League institutions known for its strong ski program. She was surrounded by other talented athletes, but she held her own. Her times were competitive. Her technique was improving. Olympic dreams seemed not just possible but probable. Everything seemed to be going perfectly for Moriah's athletic career. She had the pedigree, the training, the talent, and the work ethic. National team selection seemed like the logical next step. From there, it would be the Olympics. The same path her aunt had walked, the same dream her father had achieved, until disaster struck. Just before national team selection, during what should have been a routine training run, Moriah suffered a devastating knee injury. It happened in an instant. One moment she was carving a perfect turn, and the next she was lying in the snow. Her knee twisted at an unnatural angle, pain shooting through her leg. The diagnosis was brutal. Multiple ligament tears, the kind of injury that ends careers. Surgery was required, followed by months of rehabilitation. But even after all that, there were no guarantees. The doctors were honest with her. Her knee might never be the same. The explosive movements required for competitive alpine skiing might be too much for the damaged joint. Her dreams of Olympic glory seemed over at age 20. For many athletes, this would have been the end of the story, the injury that closes the final chapter, that forces you to become a regular person with a regular job and memories of what might have been. But Moriah Wilson was not most athletes. During her rehabilitation, physical therapists recommended cycling as a low-impact way to rebuild her strength. The circular motion of pedaling would strengthen her muscles, without putting the same stress on her knee that skiing demanded. It was supposed to be just physical therapy, just a means to an end. But something unexpected happened. As Moriah spent more time on the bike, she discovered an extraordinary talent for cycling. More than that, she discovered a love for it that surprised even her. The feeling of the wind in her face, the rhythm of pedaling, the way the landscape flowed past her, it spoke to something deep in her athletic soul. She began exploring gravel racing, a relatively new discipline at the time. Gravel racing is not like the Tour de France that most people picture when they think of competitive cycling. It is not about riding on smooth pavement in a tight pack of riders wearing matching jerseys. Gravel racing is something else entirely. It is long-distance racing across unpaved roads, mountain trails, dirt paths, and even creek crossings. The courses can be 50 miles, 100 miles, or even longer. They demand incredible endurance, but also strength to power through loose gravel and mud. They require quick adaptation skills because the terrain is constantly changing. One minute you are on a smooth dirt road, the next you are navigating rocky descents or steep climbs. It is a discipline that rewards the kind of all-around athleticism that Moriah had developed during her years as a ski racer. The leg strength, the balance, the mental toughness to push through pain and fatigue. Everything she had built in one sport transferred perfectly to another. Moriah emerged like a comet in the gravel racing world in 2022. She won the Sea Otter Classic, one of the sport's premier events. Then she won the Unbound Gravel 100-mile race, crossing the finish line with a 25-minute lead over second place. 25 minutes. In a race where competitors are often separated by seconds, she won by 25 minutes. That is how dominant she was. The cycling community took notice. Here was someone who had come from a completely different sport, someone who had only been seriously racing for a short time, and she was destroying fields of experienced competitors who had been gravel racing for years. Sponsors came calling. Magazine profiles were written. She was becoming a star. This is why she was considered the overwhelming favorite for the Gravel Locos race in Rica, Texas on May 14, 2022. Everyone expected her to win. The question was not if she would win, but by how much. May 10th, 2022. Late in the evening, Moriah arrived at her friend's house in Austin. She had flown in from her home in Vermont, and the friend had offered to let her stay for a few days before the race. It was a generous gesture, the kind that the tight-knit gravel racing community was known for. Racers often opened their homes to visiting competitors, understanding that traveling to races was expensive, and that the sport's family atmosphere was part of what made it special. Moriah was tired from the travel and from her training schedule. She unpacked her bags, set up her bike, and went straight to sleep in the guest room. She had planned to visit the local pool the next day to do some light swimming as part of her recovery routine. The next morning came. Her friend woke up first and quietly moved through the house, trying not to disturb the sleeping athlete. She looked in on Moriah and saw her still deep in sleep. Since Moriah had an important race coming up, the friend did not want to wake her. Rest was important. The friend left the house alone to run errands. Nearly half a day passed. The friend returned home at 9:45 in the evening. All the lights in the house were off. She said she was going to the pool, the friend thought, but she's not back yet. This seemed odd but not alarming. Maybe Moriah had met up with other cyclists in the area. Maybe she had gone out for a meal. The Austin cycling community was active and welcoming, so it was possible. The friend headed to the bathroom to take a shower before bed. The door was closed but not locked. She turned the handle, pushed it open, and flipped on the light switch. The shocking scene that unfolded in that moment would change everything. This was not supposed to happen in a quiet Austin neighborhood. This was not supposed to happen to a bright, talented young woman who was just beginning to reach her peak. This was not supposed to happen at all, but it had. And now the question was why? Now we need to talk about the woman who would destroy Moriah's bright future. The woman whose jealousy and obsession would lead to murder. Her name was Kaitlin Armstrong, and she was 34 years old at the time of the killing. Kaitlin Armstrong was born and raised in Livonia, Michigan, a middle-class suburb of Detroit. On the surface, her early life seemed unremarkable. She attended local schools, had friends, participated in activities. But beneath that surface, there were cracks that would widen over time. Kaitlin had an outgoing personality. She was the kind of person who could walk into a room and start a conversation with anyone. She loved to travel, always planning the next adventure, the next experience. During a trip to Bali, she fell in love with yoga and even obtained instructor certification. She studied the philosophy behind the practice, the breathing techniques, the meditation. When she returned to the United States, she worked as both a yoga instructor and a real estate agent, juggling two careers that allowed her the flexibility to continue traveling. On the surface, she seemed like a free-spirited, independent woman living life on her own terms, the kind of person you might admire, even envy. But beneath that surface lay deep scars that had never properly healed. Kaitlin's childhood had been marked by abandonment and neglect. Her mother struggled with alcoholism, and the disease had consumed much of her ability to parent effectively. There were days when young Kaitlin would come home from school to find her mother passed out, empty bottles scattered around the house. There were nights when she would have to put herself to bed, make her own meals, essentially raise herself. Her father had disappeared after the divorce when she was young, cutting off all contact with his daughter. He did not send birthday cards. He did not call on holidays. As far as Kaitlin knew, he had simply decided that being a father was too inconvenient, too much work, and he had walked away without looking back. As a daughter, she had never received proper care from the people who were supposed to love her unconditionally. This left wounds that would shape her understanding of relationships for the rest of her life. During her vulnerable teenage years, she experienced sexual assault. The details of this trauma are not fully public, and out of respect for the complexity of such experiences, we will not speculate. But what is known is that this event twisted her understanding of love, trust, and intimacy as she grew into adulthood. When she entered romantic relationships, the patterns became clear to those who knew her well. She would desperately crave affection, seeking constant reassurance that she was loved, that she would not be abandoned again. She would become obsessively attached to her partners, unable to tolerate any separation or independence. Friends and former boyfriends would later tell investigators about her behavior. She used location tracking apps to monitor where her partners were at all times. She would check their phones when they were not looking, reading text messages and emails. She would show up unexpectedly at places where they said they would be, just to verify they were telling the truth. She would question them about who they had talked to, who they had looked at, whether they found other women attractive. This pattern of surveillance and control continued throughout her adult life, growing more intense with each relationship. It was not just jealousy in the normal sense. It was an all-consuming need to possess and control, driven by a terror of being abandoned again. The economic impact of COVID-19 hit Kaitlin hard in 2020. Her yoga classes, which had provided a steady income and a sense of purpose, had to close. Group classes were prohibited. The yoga studio where she taught shut down. She struggled financially during this period, watching her savings dwindle as months passed with little work. Anxiety consumed her during this time, feeding into her existing mental health struggles. But Kaitlin was not someone who would easily give up. She was resourceful and determined. When she set her mind to something, she would see it through to the end, no matter what obstacles appeared in her path. She would find a way, through sheer force of will if necessary. These qualities, determination and resourcefulness, are normally admirable traits. But in Kaitlin's case, twisted by trauma and mental illness, they would manifest in the most terrifying way possible. When we look at Kaitlin Armstrong's background, we see a complex human being. She was not born evil. She was not a monster from birth. Childhood trauma, abandonment issues, and economic stress had gradually warped her psyche over decades. The wounds from her past had never healed, and instead of seeking help, she'd allowed them to fester and grow. But understanding her background does not excuse what she did. Understanding is not the same as forgiving. It only helps us comprehend how a seemingly normal person, someone who taught yoga and sold real estate and had friends, can transform into a killer. The question that remains is, how did this woman from Michigan cross paths with a cycling star from Vermont? How did their lives, which should never have intersected, collide in such a devastating way? The answer lies with one man. A man who would unknowingly become the bridge between victim and perpetrator, the connection point in a fatal triangle. In 2019, Kaitlin Armstrong was scrolling through a dating app when she came across a profile that caught her attention. The man was athletic, adventurous, and shared her love of the outdoors. His name was Colin Strickland. He was 35 years old and worked as a professional cyclist, one of the top gravel racers in the world. Their connection was instant. They matched on the app and began messaging immediately. Within days, they had met in person for their first date. Both were active and athletic. Both loved cycling, camping, and adventure. They quickly became close and soon developed into a romantic relationship. Through Colin, Kaitlin discovered competitive cycling. She had always been athletic, but she had never considered racing seriously. Colin encouraged her to try it, and she showed natural talent. She began participating in amateur competitions, and although she was not at Colin's elite level, she was good enough to be competitive in her category. Then 2020 arrived and COVID-19 struck worldwide. Kaitlin's yoga classes were forced to close, and she faced the financial difficulties we discussed earlier. She was stressed, anxious about money, uncertain about the future. This is when Colin made a proposal that seemed caring at the time. "Move in with me," he suggested. "We can figure this out together." They started living together in Colin's home in Austin, Texas. It seemed like a solution to Kaitlin's problems. She would not have to worry about rent. They could support each other through the pandemic, and being together constantly would deepen their relationship. They even launched a business partnership during this time. They would buy used camping trailers, RVs, and mobile homes, renovate them inside and out, then sell them at a profit or rent them out as short-term accommodations. It was the kind of entrepreneurial venture that appealed to both of them. Kaitlin was outgoing and easily attracted customers with her friendly personality. Colin mainly managed the contractors and interior designers who did the actual renovation work. On paper, they were a perfect team. Their business grew steadily, and they seemed to be building a life together. But living together 24 hours a day during a pandemic put enormous stress on their relationship. The patterns of behavior that Kaitlin had shown in previous relationships, the surveillance and control, intensified. Colin began to feel suffocated. He felt like he could not breathe, could not have any space or independence. In October of 2020, after months of increasing tension, Colin made a difficult decision. He broke up with Kaitlin, but here is where things became complicated. Despite breaking up, they continued living together. The housing market was challenging. They had business obligations. And perhaps there was a part of Colin that still cared about Kaitlin and did not want to abandon her when she was struggling financially. Kaitlin, for her part, seemed to accept the breakup on the surface, but those who knew her well suspected she had not truly let go. She still loved Colin. More than that, she felt she owned him. He was hers, and the idea that he might move on without her was intolerable. By May of 2021, Colin felt he needed to truly move forward with his life. He started casually dating other people. And that is when he met Moriah Wilson. Colin and Moriah had been in the same competitive cycling circles for years. They knew each other as fellow athletes, people who shared a passion for the sport, but they had never been particularly close until Colin reached out to Moriah through a cycling app. They began chatting about training techniques, favorite trails, upcoming races. It was friendly and professional at first, two athletes talking shop. But over time, something more developed. They started meeting up when they were in the same city for races. They would go for rides together, grab meals, spend time talking about their lives beyond cycling. It is important to understand the nature of their relationship. According to those close to both of them, Colin and Moriah's connection was complicated. They cared about each other, enjoyed each other's company, and yes, there was a romantic element at times. But neither of them was looking for a serious relationship. Moriah was focused on her athletic career, traveling constantly for competitions. Colin was still figuring out what he wanted after his breakup with Kaitlin. What they had was a friendship with occasional romantic elements, the kind of ambiguous modern relationship that is hard to define with traditional labels. They were not boyfriend and girlfriend in the conventional sense, but they were more than just friends. Colin never told Kaitlin about Moriah. This was a critical mistake, one he would regret for the rest of his life. He saved Moriah's contact information in his phone under a fake name. When they texted, he would delete the messages afterward. He told himself he was being discreet, that there was no point in hurting Kaitlin's feelings over something that was not even a serious relationship. But he underestimated Kaitlin's determination to know everything about his life, and he failed to account for modern technology's ability to expose secrets. Colin and Kaitlin's relationship had settled into an uncomfortable pattern by late 2021. They were officially broken up, but they still lived in the same house due to financial and business ties. Sometimes they would slip back into physical intimacy, only to pull away again. It was messy and undefined, the kind of situation that creates confusion and resentment. Kaitlin had become increasingly fixated on Colin's activities. She needed to know where he was, who he was with, what he was doing. The abandonment trauma from her childhood had made the idea of losing Colin unbearable, even though they were not technically together anymore. And then she discovered the iPad. Colin had an iPad that he used primarily for business purposes, managing their trailer renovation projects and communicating with contractors. What he did not realize was that his iPad was synced to his iPhone through Apple's iCloud service. This meant that every text message, every phone call, every notification that appeared on his phone also appeared on the iPad. Kaitlin found the iPad and began monitoring it obsessively. She would check it multiple times a day, reading Colin's messages, seeing who he was talking to, where he was going. It was the ultimate surveillance tool, and it gave her access to every private corner of his digital life. Through this surveillance, she discovered Moriah. She saw the messages between Colin and Moriah, even though Colin had saved her under a fake name and deleted their conversations. The deletions happened on his phone, but the messages still appeared briefly on the iPad before he could delete them there too. It was enough. Kaitlin's jealousy began to build. Who was this woman? Why was Colin talking to her so much? Were they seeing each other? The questions consumed her thoughts. Then, in January of 2022, Kaitlin discovered something else through the iPad. Colin and Moriah were connected on Strava, a fitness tracking app popular among cyclists. Strava allows users to record their rides and workouts using GPS, and crucially, it allows users to follow each other and see each other's real-time locations during activities. Since Kaitlin had access to all of Colin's synchronized data through the iPad, she could see everything he saw on Strava, including Moriah's location whenever Moriah was recording a ride or activity. This was the key that would unlock Kaitlin's ability to commit murder. Real-time GPS tracking, the ability to know exactly where Moriah was at any given moment. For months, Kaitlin monitored this information. She watched as Colin and Moriah's interactions continued. She saw them meeting up in various cities when they were both at the same races. She tracked Moriah's training rides, learning her patterns and habits. The rage and jealousy built slowly, like pressure in a sealed container. On the surface, Kaitlin seemed to be going about her life normally. She taught yoga classes. She worked on trailer renovations. She smiled and chatted with friends. But inside, an obsession was growing. In her mind, Moriah Wilson was not just another woman. Moriah was the person who was stealing Colin away from her. Moriah was the reason Colin would not come back to her fully. Moriah was the obstacle that needed to be removed. May 11th, 2022. The day everything came to a head. Colin had traveled to Bentonville, Arkansas for a cycling event. While he was there, He learned that Moriah was going to be in Austin in the coming days for the gravel locust race. They made plans to meet up. Colin returned to Austin on the afternoon of May 11th. Later that afternoon, he sent a text to Moriah suggesting they go swimming at a local pool to cool off from the Texas heat. Moriah agreed. What Colin did not know was that Kaitlin was watching all of this unfold through the synchronized iPad. She could see his messages to Moriah. She could see Moriah's location through Strava. She knew they were meeting up. Colin picked up Moriah from her friend's house at around 5:30 in the afternoon. They drove to Deep Eddy Pool, a popular swimming spot in Austin. They swam for a while, relaxing and talking. After swimming, they went to dinner together at Pool Burger, a casual restaurant nearby. According to security camera footage and witness statements, they seemed relaxed and happy. Two friends enjoying each other's company, sharing a meal and conversation. Nothing about their behavior suggested the tragedy that was about to unfold. Throughout this entire time, Kaitlin was following them. She had gotten into her black Jeep Cherokee and driven to the pool. She sat in the parking lot, watching. When they left for dinner, she followed them to the restaurant. She sat in her vehicle outside, watching through the windows as they ate. The rage that had been building for months was reaching its peak. In Kaitlin's mind, what she was witnessing was not friendship. It was betrayal. It was Colin choosing Moriah over her. It was the abandonment she had feared her entire life, playing out right before her eyes. After dinner, around 8:30 in the evening, Colin drove Moriah back to her friend's house. He dropped her off at the curb. They said goodbye. Colin drove away, heading back to his own home. Security camera footage would later show that Colin's truck departed the area at 8:36 in the evening. 1 minute later, at 8:37, a black Jeep Cherokee matching the description of Kaitlin's vehicle appeared on the same cameras, driving slowly down the street toward the house where Moriah was staying. 1 minute. That was the gap between Colin leaving and Kaitlin arriving. What happened next has been reconstructed from forensic evidence, because there were no witnesses to the actual murder. But investigators believe the sequence of events went something like this. Kaitlin parked her Jeep and walked to the front door of the house. She knocked or rang the doorbell. Moriah, expecting perhaps that Colin had forgotten something or that her host had returned, answered the door. Kaitlin pushed her way inside. Words were exchanged. Perhaps Moriah tried to close the door, tried to defend herself. A struggle ensued that moved through the house toward the bathroom, and then Kaitlin pulled out the 9mm handgun she had brought with her. She fired 3 times. 2 bullets struck Moriah in the head. 1 struck her directly in the heart. Moriah Wilson died almost instantly. She never had a chance to defend herself, never had a chance to call for help, never had a chance to understand why this was happening to her. Kaitlin fled the scene immediately. She grabbed Moriah's expensive racing bike, perhaps thinking she could make it look like a robbery. But within minutes, she abandoned the bike in nearby bushes, realizing that carrying a bicycle through the neighborhood would make her too visible, too memorable. She got back in her Jeep and drove away. By the time Moriah's friend would return home 90 minutes later to make the horrific discovery, Kaitlin was already planning her next moves. The investigation into Moriah Wilson's murder began immediately after the 911 call came in at 9:50 p.m. on May 11th. Austin Police Department detectives arrived at the scene and quickly determined this was not a simple case. The precision of the shots, the abandoned bicycle, the lack of any other theft or vandalism, all of it pointed to something more targeted than a random crime. Lead Detective Richard Spittler took charge of the investigation. He was a 20-year veteran of the department with extensive experience in homicide cases. As he walked through the crime scene, examining the evidence, he knew they were looking for someone with a specific motive to kill Moriah Wilson. The first step was to establish Moriah's movements on the day of her death. Who had she been with? Where had she gone? Detectives quickly learned about her plans to compete in the gravel locust race and began interviewing people in the cycling community. That is when Colin Strickland's name came up. Multiple people mentioned that Colin and Moriah were friends, that they had planned to meet up while Moriah was in town. Detectives obtained security camera footage from Deep Eddy Pool and Pool Burger, confirming that Colin and Moriah had spent the afternoon and evening together on May 11th. Colin became a person of interest, though not necessarily a suspect. Detectives needed to understand his relationship with Moriah and determine if he had any involvement in her death. On May 12th, just 1 day after the murder, Detective Spittler interviewed Colin at his home. Colin was cooperative but clearly shaken. He confirmed that he had been with Moriah the previous day, explained their friendship, and provided details about their activities together. Then came the crucial question. Did you have any romantic involvement with the victim? Colin hesitated. Then he admitted that yes, they had been romantically involved on and off over the past year. It was not a traditional relationship, he explained, but there were feelings there. Detective Spittler asked about Colin's current living situation. That is when Colin revealed he lived with his ex-girlfriend, Kaitlin Armstrong, and that their relationship was complicated. The detective's instincts immediately alerted him. An ex-girlfriend, living in the same house, the potential for jealousy. This was a lead worth pursuing. Tell me about Kaitlin, Detective Spittler said. How did she feel about your friendship with Moriah? Colin became uncomfortable. He admitted that he had never told Kaitlin about Moriah. He had kept the relationship secret because he knew Kaitlin would be jealous. He explained Caitlin's history of possessive behavior, her need to control and monitor his activities. Then Colin dropped the bombshell. Kaitlin owns a gun, he said. A 9mm handgun. The same caliber that had killed Moriah Wilson. Detective Spittler asked Colin to describe the gun. Colin pulled out his phone and showed the detective a photograph he had taken months earlier. The gun was clearly visible in the image. Investigators would later be able to identify it as a Sig Sauer 9mm pistol. Based on this information, detectives immediately began looking into Kaitlin Armstrong. They pulled her vehicle registration and learned she drove a black Jeep Cherokee. They obtained security camera footage from the neighborhood where Moriah had been killed. And there it was. Clear as day. A black Jeep Cherokee matching the description of Caitlin's vehicle, appearing on camera at 8:37 p.m. on May 11th, 1 minute after Colin had left the area. The Jeep drove slowly past the house where Moriah was staying, then disappeared from view. Additional camera footage from earlier in the evening showed the same Jeep following Colin's truck from the swimming pool to the restaurant, then following them again from the restaurant toward the house where Moriah was staying. Kaitlin Armstrong had been stalking them all evening. Detectives obtained a search warrant for ballistics records. They contacted the gun shop where Kaitlin had purchased her Sig Sauer pistol and requested the shell casing that would have been generated during the mandatory test firing when she bought the gun. The ballistics comparison came back quickly. The shell casings found at the murder scene matched the test firing from Caitlin's gun. It was not just the same type of gun. It was her specific gun, identified by the unique markings left by its firing pin and ejector. By May 13th, just 2 days after the murder, investigators had compelling evidence pointing to Kaitlin Armstrong as the killer. They had motive, means, and opportunity. They had video evidence placing her vehicle at the scene. They had ballistics evidence linking her gun to the crime. But when detectives went to Colin's house to question Kaitlin, they made a critical error that would allow her to escape. Detective Spittler and his partner arrived at the house on the afternoon of May 13th. Kaitlin agreed to come to the police station for questioning. She seemed calm, almost too calm for someone whose ex-boyfriend had just been connected to a murder investigation. At the station, Kaitlin sat across from Detective Spittler in the interview room. The detective explained that they were investigating Moriah Wilson's murder and that Caitlin's name had come up during the investigation. Where were you on the evening of May 11th between 8 and 10 p.m.? Detective Spittler asked. I was at home, Kaitlin replied without hesitation. I was doing yoga and watching TV. Can anyone confirm that? Colin was there for part of the evening, but he went out to meet a friend. The detective showed her the security camera footage of the black Jeep following Colin's truck. This looks like your vehicle. Kaitlin studied the footage. Lots of people drive black Jeeps, she said calmly. That could be anyone. Detective Spittler pressed harder, asking about her relationship with Colin, whether she knew about his friendship with Moriah, how she felt about it. Kaitlin remained composed throughout, giving careful answers that did not quite admit or deny anything significant. Then came the ballistics question. We have evidence that suggests your firearm may have been involved in this crime. Where is your gun now? I sold it, Kaitlin said. A few months ago, to some guy I met online. I don't remember his name. This was a lie, but investigators had no way to immediately disprove it. The interview lasted about an hour. At the end, Detective Spittler told Kaitlin she was free to go, but should remain available for follow-up questions. He did not arrest her, even though he had probable cause to do so. This was the mistake, because the arrest warrant had a clerical error. Due to confusion over an old traffic ticket, the warrant listed Caitlin's date of birth incorrectly. Legally, this meant they could not hold her on the murder charge until the paperwork was corrected. Rather than detaining her on a lesser charge while they fixed the warrant, they let her walk out of the police station. Kaitlin Armstrong knew at that moment that she was on borrowed time. The police suspected her. They had evidence. It was only a matter of hours, maybe a day or two, before they would come back with a corrected warrant and arrest her. She had to run. And she had to run far. Within hours of leaving the police station, Kaitlin began executing a plan that suggests she had been preparing for this possibility. She did not panic. She did not make rash decisions. Instead, she acted with the same determination and resourcefulness that had characterized her entire life. First, she sold her black Jeep Cherokee to a dealership for cash. This eliminated the vehicle that connected her to the crime scene. It also gave her money for her escape. Then she went home and packed. Not everything, just the essentials. Clothes, toiletries, her passport. She left most of her possessions behind, knowing that taking too much would slow her down. She called her sister and told her she needed to leave town for a while. The sister later claimed she had no idea Kaitlin was fleeing from a murder investigation, but she agreed to help. She gave Kaitlin cash and drove her to Austin Airport. On May 17th, just 4 days after her interview with police, Kaitlin Armstrong boarded a flight from Austin to Houston under her own name. From Houston, she flew to New York's LaGuardia Airport. She spent one night in New York, staying at a hotel near the airport. The next day, May 18th, she boarded a flight to San Jose, Costa Rica, using her sister's name and passport. The sisters looked similar, enough that Kaitlin was able to pass through security and board the international flight without triggering any alarms. By the time Austin detectives returned with a corrected arrest warrant on May 19th, Kaitlin Armstrong had been out of the country for over a day. She had vanished. The manhunt that followed would become one of the most extensive international fugitive pursuits in recent memory. The United States Marshals Service took over the investigation, bringing their specialized expertise in tracking and capturing fugitives who flee across borders. U.S. Marshal Brandon Filla was assigned as the lead investigator. He reviewed all the evidence from the murder investigation and began piecing together Kaitlin's escape route. Bank records showed she had withdrawn large amounts of cash in the days before she fled. Her sister's credit card showed a charge at LaGuardia Airport, and immigration records confirmed that someone using the sister's passport had entered Costa Rica on May 18th. The Marshals Service issued a red notice through Interpol, alerting law enforcement agencies worldwide that Kaitlin Armstrong was wanted for first-degree murder. Her photograph was distributed to police departments, border control agencies, and airports across the globe. But Costa Rica is a popular destination for Americans looking to disappear. The country has a large expatriate community, a relaxed approach to immigration enforcement, and plenty of remote areas where someone could hide. Finding one woman among millions of residents and tourists would be like finding a needle in a haystack. Marshal Filla and his team began working with Costa Rican authorities, reviewing security camera footage from the San Jose airport, checking hotel registrations, following up on tips from the public. Days turned into weeks with no solid leads. Kaitlin, meanwhile, was living under the radar. She had dyed her hair from blonde to dark brown and changed her appearance as much as possible. She was staying in a hostel in Santa Teresa, a beach town on Costa Rica's Pacific coast, popular with surfers and backpackers. Using cash she had brought with her and money wired by her sister, Kaitlin managed to survive without leaving a clear paper trail. She avoided using credit cards or anything that could be traced back to her real identity. But she had a problem. The money was running out, and she needed a way to support herself while remaining hidden. She could not go home. She knew that arrest and almost certain conviction for murder awaited her in Texas. So Kaitlin did something remarkable. She got a job. Not just any job, but a job teaching yoga at a boutique yoga studio in Santa Teresa called the Jumping Jaguar. She introduced herself as Ari, short for Ariana, and claimed to be from California. She showed the studio owner her yoga instructor certification, which was real, and demonstrated her teaching abilities. The owner was impressed and hired her on the spot. For the next several weeks, Kaitlin lived a double life. By day, she was Ari the yoga instructor, teaching classes to tourists and locals, smiling and chatting with students. By night, she was a fugitive hiding from one of the most intensive international manhunts in recent memory. She kept her head down, avoided attention, and slowly began to believe she might actually get away with it. Costa Rica felt safe. The American authorities seemed far away. Maybe they would eventually give up. Maybe she could build a new life here as Ari and leave Kaitlin Armstrong behind forever. But the U.S. Marshal Service does not give up. And they were getting closer. A tip came in from someone who thought they had seen Kaitlin at a hostel in Santa Teresa. The description matched. Dark hair, American accent, traveling alone. Marshal Filla immediately coordinated with Costa Rican authorities to follow up. On June 24th, 43 days after Kaitlin had fled Texas, A combined team of U.S. Marshals and Costa Rican law enforcement officers descended on Santa Teresa. They had narrowed down her location to a specific hostel based on the tip and additional surveillance work. But they needed to be certain they had the right person. Kaitlin had changed her appearance significantly. They could not just burst in and arrest every American woman with dark hair. That is when they came up with a plan. 2 members of the team would pose as tourists looking for yoga classes. They would visit the Jumping Jaguar studio and try to get a close look at the instructor who called herself Ari. The 2 officers entered the studio on the afternoon of June 24th. They asked about yoga classes and whether there were any instructors available to talk to them about the studio's philosophy. The owner called over Ari, who approached with a friendly smile. "Hi, I'm Ari," she said. "Welcome to Jumping Jaguar. Are you here on vacation?" The officers engaged her in conversation, asking about class schedules and pricing. But then they noticed something. This woman named Ari seemed to have difficulty understanding the local Spanish being spoken around her by other studio employees, even though she claimed to have been in Costa Rica for months. So they deliberately spoke to her in Spanish, asking a question about whether she offered private sessions. Ari's face showed confusion. She reached for her phone, opening Google Translate to try to understand what they were saying. That is when one of the officers got a clear look at her eyes. There is one thing about a human face that is almost impossible to change, even with surgery and makeup and dyed hair. The eyes, the shape, the spacing, the distinctive patterns of the iris. The officer had studied Kaitlin Armstrong's photographs for weeks. He knew those eyes. The eyes staring back at him belonged to Kaitlin Armstrong. "You are under arrest," he said in English, showing his badge. Ari's face went pale. She tried to protest, claiming they had the wrong person, that her name was Ariana, that this was a mistake. But within minutes, surrounded by armed officers, she gave up the charade. "My name is Kaitlin Armstrong," she finally admitted. "But I didn't kill anyone. You have to believe me. I didn't do it." After 43 days of international cat and mouse, after fleeing across borders and hiding in plain sight, Kaitlin Armstrong had finally been captured. When investigators searched her belongings at the hostel, they found evidence of extensive efforts to change her appearance. Boxes of hair dye, makeup in shades much different from what she had used before, and something else that explained the white bandages visible on her face in photos from the yoga studio. Kaitlin had recently undergone plastic surgery. Specifically, she had gotten a rhinoplasty, or nose job. She had also received lip fillers and a forehead lift. All of this was done at a medical tourism facility in Costa Rica, where such procedures are significantly cheaper than in the United States and often do not require extensive identification checks. The bandages on her nose in the yoga studio photos were from the recent rhinoplasty. She had been recovering from surgery while teaching classes, trying to alter her appearance enough that facial recognition software would not identify her. Perhaps all that work as a yoga instructor during her time on the run had been primarily to pay for these surgical procedures. She had been planning for the long term, preparing to disappear forever into a new identity. But it had not been enough. The Marshals Service had found her. Following extradition proceedings that took several weeks, Kaitlin Armstrong was returned to the United States in July of 2022. She was formally charged with first-degree murder in the death of Moriah Wilson and with being a fugitive from justice. She was held without bail at Travis County Jail in Austin to await trial. The story seemed to be reaching its conclusion. The killer had been caught. Justice would be served. But Kaitlin Armstrong had one more surprise in store for the authorities and the public. October 2023. Kaitlin had been held in county jail for over a year, awaiting her trial. The facility was a modern, secure building designed to hold dangerous criminals. Escapes were extremely rare. On the morning of October 11th, guards noticed that Kaitlin appeared to be injured. She claimed she had fallen down the stairs during recreation time the previous evening and hurt her leg badly. She was limping heavily, wincing in pain with each step, and could barely put weight on the injured leg. The jail's medical staff examined her and determined she needed to be taken to an outside medical facility for x-rays to rule out a fracture. This was standard procedure for injuries that could not be properly assessed with the jail's limited medical equipment. The next morning, October 12th, Kaitlin was scheduled for transport to a nearby medical center. According to standard security regulations, inmates being transported must be handcuffed at both hands and feet to prevent any possibility of escape. However, given Kaitlin's apparent serious leg injury, the supervising guard made a judgment call. If they shackled her feet while her leg was potentially fractured, they could cause additional injury and face liability. So they decided to only handcuff her hands, leaving her feet free. It was a compassionate decision that would prove to be a critical mistake. At the medical facility, Kaitlin was processed through intake and taken to an examination room. 2 correctional officers remained with her at all times, standing near the door while medical staff prepared to examine her leg. There was a brief moment of distraction. The medical technician needed a form signed. One guard turned to check the paperwork. The other guard's attention was momentarily diverted by a question from the receptionist. That is when Kaitlin made her move. She suddenly jumped off the examination table and bolted toward the exit. Her injured leg, which had seemed so painful and immobile just moments before, was working perfectly fine. She sprinted at full speed through the medical facility's corridors. The injury had been completely fake. She had been planning this escape for days, possibly weeks. She had deliberately faked the fall, faked the pain, faked the inability to walk, all to create the opportunity that had just presented itself. Remember, Kaitlin Armstrong had maintained her physical fitness through years of yoga and cycling. She had core strength, cardiovascular endurance, and explosive speed. Even in handcuffs, she was faster than many people half her age. She burst through the front doors of the medical facility and ran into the parking lot. She leaped over a 4-foot fence in a single bound, her handcuffed hands not slowing her down significantly. She sprinted down the street, her legs pumping, her breath coming in gasps. She made it more than a full city block before multiple correctional officers, who had been radioed about the escape, managed to catch up to her and tackle her to the ground. 10 minutes. That is how long her final taste of freedom lasted. 10 minutes of running through Austin streets in an orange jail jumpsuit with her hands cuffed in front of her, before being wrestled to the pavement and dragged back into custody. It was almost impressive, in a terrifying way. Here was a woman who had already fled the country once, who had lived on the run for 43 days, who had undergone plastic surgery to change her appearance, and even after being caught, even after being held in a secure facility for over a year, she was still looking for ways to escape. She would not give up. She would not accept her fate. She would fight until there was no fight left in her. Additional charges were filed for escape from custody. Her security level at the jail was upgraded to the highest classification. She would now be under constant surveillance, with additional restraints during any future transports. There would be no more chances to run. November 2023. The first-degree murder trial finally began. The courtroom was packed with journalists, Moriah's family and friends, members of the cycling community, and curious onlookers who had followed the case since the beginning. The prosecution team, led by Assistant District Attorney Ricky Jones, laid out their case methodically. They presented the evidence piece by piece, building a narrative that left little doubt about Kaitlin's guilt. They showed the security camera footage of Kaitlin's Jeep, following Colin and Moriah throughout the evening of May 11th. They presented the ballistics evidence linking Kaitlin's gun to the shell casings found at the murder scene. They called witnesses who testified about Kaitlin's jealous and possessive behavior, her history of surveillance and control in relationships. They brought in digital forensics experts, who explained how Kaitlin had used the synchronized iPad to monitor Colin's communications and track Moriah's location through the Strava fitness app. Based on this digital evidence, prosecutors reconstructed the events of that fateful evening with chilling precision. For months before the murder, Kaitlin had been monitoring Colin's communications through the synced iPad. She knew about his friendship with Moriah, and her jealousy had been building steadily. She had discovered that Colin and Moriah were connected on Strava, the fitness tracking app that allowed users to share their locations during workouts. Since Kaitlin had access to all of Colin's synchronized data, she could monitor Moriah's real-time location through this app whenever Moriah was recording an activity. On May 11th, she had watched through the iPad as Colin and Moriah made plans to meet up. She saw Colin's text messages suggesting they go swimming. She saw Moriah's responses agreeing to meet, and most critically, she saw Moriah's GPS location updating throughout the evening as Moriah recorded her activities on Strava. In Kaitlin's mind, this was not friendship. This was Colin cheating on her right before her eyes. The fact that they were technically broken up did not matter to her. He was hers. He belonged to her. And this woman was taking him away. The rage that had been building for months finally exploded that evening. According to the prosecution's timeline, Kaitlin left her house shortly after Colin left to pick up Moriah. She followed them to Deep Eddy Pool and waited in the parking lot. She followed them to Pool Burger for dinner and watched from her vehicle. Throughout all of this, she was also tracking Moriah's location on Strava, watching the GPS pin that showed exactly where Moriah was in real time. When Colin dropped Moriah off at 8:36 p.m., Kaitlin was already nearby. She watched Colin drive away. Then, just 1 minute later, she pulled up to the house. She had made her decision. She had brought the gun. This was premeditated. This was first-degree murder. She approached the front door and knocked. When Moriah answered, Kaitlin forced her way inside. A confrontation occurred. Perhaps Kaitlin accused her of stealing Colin. Perhaps Moriah tried to defend herself, tried to explain that it was not like that. But Kaitlin had not come to talk. She had come to eliminate what she saw as a problem. She pulled out the 9mm handgun and fired 3 times. 2 shots to the head, 1 shot to the heart. The precision suggested this was not a heat-of-the-moment killing. The shots were too accurate, too deliberate. Moriah Wilson died almost instantly. She had been 25 years old. She had been at the peak of her athletic career. She had been loved by family and friends. She had a bright future ahead of her, and in less than a minute, it was all taken away. After showing the jury this comprehensive narrative, the prosecution rested their case. The evidence was overwhelming. The digital trail was undeniable. The ballistics match was conclusive. However, the defense team, led by attorney Rica, argued that this was all circumstantial evidence. Yes, Kaitlin had been jealous. Yes, she had followed them that evening. Yes, it was her gun. But where was the proof that she had actually pulled the trigger? The prosecution has shown you that my client had motive and opportunity, Cofer told the jury. But they have not shown you direct evidence that she committed this murder. There is no eyewitness. There is no confession. There is no video of the actual shooting. He suggested alternative theories. Could someone else have been in the house? Could someone else have used her gun? After all, Colin also had access to the weapon. Was it not suspicious that Colin had been with Moriah just minutes before she died? The defense also pointed out that the prosecution's timeline was tight. According to security cameras, Kaitlin's Jeep appeared at 8:37 p.m., just 1 minute after Colin left. The medical examiner estimated time of death as between 8:45 and 9 p.m. That meant Kaitlin had at most 8 minutes to park, approach the house, confront Moriah, shoot her 3 times, grab the bicycle, and leave. It was possible, but the defense argued it was improbable. Technically, they had valid points. The case was built on circumstantial evidence. There was no smoking gun, no witness, no recording of the actual murder. But the judge and jury focused on one crucial detail that the defense could not adequately explain. Kaitlin's immediate flight after her first interrogation on May 13th. "Why did you run?" the judge asked during the trial. At that point, you were not even officially a murder suspect. You had been interviewed, yes, but you were free to go. If you were innocent, why did you sell your car, pack your bags, and flee the country? The defense tried to argue that Kaitlin had been scared, that she knew she was being framed, that she panicked. But this explanation did not hold up under scrutiny. An innocent person who is scared goes to a lawyer. An innocent person who believes they are being framed gathers evidence to prove their innocence. An innocent person does not board an international flight using their sister's identity, dye their hair, get plastic surgery, and hide in a foreign country for 43 days. Kaitlin's flight behavior was considered by many legal experts to be tantamount to a confession of guilt. Her actions after the murder spoke louder than any words could. On November 16th, 2023, after nearly 2 weeks of testimony and arguments, the jury deliberated for approximately 7 hours before reaching a verdict. Guilty of first-degree murder. The courtroom erupted. Moriah's mother Karen broke down in tears, her husband Eric holding her close. Moriah's friends and fellow cyclists, who had attended every day of the trial, embraced each other. Finally, after 18 months of waiting, there was a measure of justice for Moriah. Kaitlin Armstrong showed no emotion as the verdict was read. She sat perfectly still, her face blank, as if she had disconnected from the reality of what was happening. 2 days later, on November 18th, the sentencing hearing took place. Under Texas law, first-degree murder carries a mandatory sentence of life in prison, or a term of years ranging from 5 to 99 years. The prosecution asked for the maximum sentence of 90 years. They argued that Kaitlin had shown no remorse, had fled from justice, had attempted to escape from custody, and represented a continued danger to society. The defense asked for a more lenient sentence, pointing to Kaitlin's traumatic childhood, her lack of prior criminal history, and arguing that with proper mental health treatment, she could eventually be rehabilitated. The judge considered the arguments from both sides. Then he delivered his ruling. 90 years in prison. Kaitlin Armstrong is currently serving her sentence in a women's correctional facility in Texas. With no possibility of parole for at least 30 years, She will be 64 years old at the earliest possible release date. More likely, she will spend the rest of her natural life behind bars. But even this was not the end of the story. The criminal case was over, but Moriah's family still had one more battle to fight. In May of 2024, just over 2 years after Moriah's murder, her parents Karen and Eric Wilson filed a civil lawsuit against Kaitlin Armstrong. The lawsuit sought to prevent Kaitlin from profiting from any book deals, movie rights, or media appearances about the case. Under many states' Son of Sam laws, criminals cannot profit from telling their stories if those stories relate to their crimes. But civil lawsuits can go further, seeking damages for the emotional and financial harm caused by the crime. The Wilson family asked for $200 million in damages. It was an astronomical sum, one that Kaitlin could never realistically pay. But that was not the point. The point was to ensure that even if Kaitlin somehow found a way to profit from her notoriety, every penny would go to Moriah's family, rather than enriching the woman who had murdered her. The court ruled in favor of the Wilson family. Kaitlin was ordered to pay $200 million in damages and was permanently prohibited from gaining any financial benefit from telling her story through books, movies, interviews, or any other media. Of course, $200 million is a largely symbolic amount. Kaitlin Armstrong was not wealthy. She had been living paycheck to paycheck before her arrest, and before her trial, she had transferred most of her remaining assets to her mother, her sister, and even to Colin Strickland, perhaps to keep those assets out of reach of civil judgments. Kaitlin now claims to be penniless, and continues to refuse any payment to Moriah's family. The judgment will remain on record for the rest of her life, but the practical reality is that the Wilsons will likely never see a cent of that money. Still, the lawsuit accomplished its goal. If Kaitlin ever tries to sell her story, if any publisher or filmmaker ever approaches her with an offer, that money will legally belong to Moriah's family. She cannot profit from the murder. Incidentally, in June of 2024, this case was adapted into a television movie called The Yoga Teacher Killer and aired on the Lifetime channel. The case was so extraordinary, with its elements of obsession, digital surveillance, international flight, and plastic surgery, that television producers could not resist the dramatic potential. Some criticized the movie as exploitative, arguing that turning a real tragedy into entertainment dishonors the victim. Others felt it was important to tell the story to raise awareness about the dangers of obsessive relationships and the ways technology can be weaponized by abusers. Through the dedication and persistence of law enforcement across 2 countries, through the tireless work of prosecutors and investigators, Kaitlin Armstrong was successfully brought to justice. It was like something out of an action movie, an international manhunt that crossed borders and continents. Surveillance footage, ballistics analysis, digital forensics, a fugitive who altered her appearance and lived under a false identity. A dramatic capture at a yoga studio in a foreign country. But this was not a movie. This was real. A real young woman lost her life. Real parents lost their daughter. A real community lost a rising star. Even now, some questions remain unanswered, and they likely always will. Was Colin Strickland truly uninvolved in this case? It is a question that many people still ask. It is worth noting that Kaitlin transferred a significant portion of her assets to Colin before her trial. That seems unusual, does it not? Why would a woman facing a murder charge give money to her ex-boyfriend? Some speculate that Colin knew more than he admitted. On the day of the murder, Kaitlin had been following Colin and Moriah in her black SUV throughout their time together. She arrived at Moriah's house just 1 minute after Colin had left. 1 minute? With such a narrow time window, would Colin not have possibly encountered Kaitlin as he drove away? Did he really not notice her? Or did he choose to ignore what he saw? To be clear, Colin has never been charged with any crime related to this case. Investigators concluded he was not involved in the murder itself. But questions remain about whether he could have done more to prevent it. Whether he should have been more honest with both women about his relationships. Whether his secrecy and deception created the conditions that allowed tragedy to occur. These are uncomfortable questions, without clear answers. Colin Strickland has largely stayed out of the public eye since the trial ended. He has not given extensive interviews or made public statements beyond what was legally required. He continues to carry the weight of knowing that his choices, however unintentional, played a role in the events that led to Moriah's death. This case teaches us several important lessons that extend far beyond the specific tragedy of what happened to Moriah Wilson. In our digital age, the tools that are designed to connect us can also be used to harm us. Location tracking apps, synchronized devices, shared calendars, fitness trackers that broadcast our real-time location. These technologies are marketed as ways to stay close to loved ones, to share our lives, to build intimacy through transparency. But in the wrong hands, they become instruments of surveillance and control. Kaitlin used everyday consumer technology to stalk and monitor. She used an iPad synced to Colin's phone. She used a fitness app designed for athletes to share training data. She turned tools of connection into weapons of obsession. We must be more thoughtful about the digital trails we leave, the access we grant, the information we share, privacy settings, app permissions, device synchronization. These are not just technical details. They are matters of personal safety. We have also learned about the dangerous escalation of toxic relationships. Kaitlin Armstrong did not suddenly become a killer. There was a pattern that stretched back years. Jealousy, possessiveness, surveillance, control. These behaviors escalated gradually until they culminated in violence. What begins as love can transform into possession. Possession becomes obsession. Obsession becomes surveillance. And surveillance can become violence. The warning signs were there. Friends knew about Kaitlin's behavior. Colin knew about her jealous tendencies. But no one took action to intervene or protect potential victims. Perhaps they thought it was just normal relationship drama. Perhaps they believed Kaitlin would never actually hurt anyone. This case reminds us to take these warning signs seriously. Obsessive jealousy is not romantic. Constant surveillance is not caring. Possessive behavior is not love. These are red flags that should not be ignored or minimized. But we have also seen the power of justice that transcends borders. When investigators refused to give up, when they pursued the truth across countries and continents, when they coordinated with international law enforcement agencies, they showed us that accountability will follow you wherever you run. The United States Marshal Service, working with Costa Rican authorities, spent 43 days tracking Kaitlin Armstrong. They reviewed thousands of hours of security footage. They followed up on hundreds of tips. They never stopped looking. And when they found her, disguised and living under a false name in a beach town thousands of miles from the crime scene, they brought her back to face justice. In an era where international travel is easy and borders can seem porous, this case proves that geography is no longer a barrier to accountability. You cannot outrun justice. You cannot hide forever. Most importantly, we must remember Moriah Wilson, not as a victim, not as a name in a true crime story, but as a human being who lived a remarkable life, even if that life was far too short. She was a talented athlete who had overcome a career-ending injury to find success in a new sport. She was reaching her peak, poised to become one of the dominant forces in gravel racing. Sponsors were lining up. Magazine profiles were being written. The cycling world was watching her rise. But she was more than her athletic achievements. She was a daughter who made her parents proud. She was a friend who inspired loyalty and affection. She was a person who brought joy to those around her. Her story reminds us to cherish every moment, to pursue our dreams fearlessly despite setbacks and obstacles. It reminds us that tomorrow is not guaranteed, that we should tell the people we love that we love them, that we should live fully in the present, rather than always planning for a future that may never come. It also reminds us to watch out for warning signs in our relationships and communities, to speak up when we see possessive or controlling behavior, to take threats seriously, to understand that domestic violence and relationship obsession can affect anyone, regardless of success, talent, or apparent stability. Moriah was killed not by a stranger in a dark alley, but by someone connected to her social circle. Someone who seemed normal on the surface. Someone who taught yoga and sold real estate and smiled at clients. The monsters are not always obvious. They do not always announce themselves. Sometimes they look like ordinary people until obsession transforms them into something else. In a world where obsession can hide behind the mask of love, where digital surveillance can masquerade as caring, where jealousy can escalate into violence, we must remain vigilant. The truth may fade with time, but it never truly disappears. Stories may become less urgent as years pass, but the lessons they teach remain essential. Hope and despair may intertwine in cases like this. Hope that justice prevails, that killers are caught, that families find some measure of peace. Despair that the tragedy happened at all, that a young life was lost, that nothing can truly make things right again. But those who seek answers will always find their way to the light. Investigators who refuse to give up. Families who demand accountability. Communities that remember the victims and honor their memories. We will continue to follow these stories, these searches for truth that refuse to be forgotten. We will continue to remember the victims, learn from the patterns, and work toward a world where obsession does not become violence, where love does not become possession, where technology serves connection rather than control. Moriah Wilson's story will not be forgotten. Her name will be remembered not just as a victim, but as an athlete who inspired others, as a daughter who was loved, as a person whose life mattered. Thank you for taking the time to hear this story. If you found value in this detailed examination of the case, I would be grateful if you would subscribe to this channel. It helps me continue researching and sharing these important stories in a way that honors victims and seeks truth. This has been the story of Moriah Wilson, told with respect for her memory and her family's grief.